Vermont.
I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, let me begin by once again thanking Senator Lieberman and Senator Carper and Senators Collins and Brown for their long and hard work on this issue, which is of enormous consequence to the American people. Sometimes what people inside the Beltway perceive as opposed to what people outside the Beltway perceive are two different worlds. And I can tell you that back in Vermont, and I suspect in rural areas and states all over this country, people want to save the post office. They know how important it is for small businesses, for our economy, and for their own needs. So the issue that we are dealing with is a very significant issue, and I hope that as a Senate we can show America that we can come together regardless of political ideology. This really is not a progressive issue, conservative issue, Republican, Democrat, independent. This really is an issue that impacts tens of millions of Americans, and I hope we can move together as we should. I want to say a few words on the Postal Service and finances today. Everybody knows that the Postal Service is in fact facing significant financial difficulties. Revenue at the Postal Service has gone down from about $75 billion in 2008 to $66 billion last year. In the midst of the digital revolution, first-class mail has gone down significantly, no debate about that, and it has been replaced and will continue to be replaced by email usage and the Internet. There is no question but that this is a real issue that has got to be addressed. But, Mr. President, let me be very clear that in terms of the revenue problems facing the Postal Service, the major reason, the major problems that we have are not just the decline in first-class mail. It is an issue. It happens not to be the major issue. The major issue, in fact, is that the Postal Service has seen a significant loss in mail volume and revenue due to the most severe recession that our country has faced since the 1930s. As the Postal Service indicated on May 30th, 2010, and I quote, "The effects of the recession account for 2/3 of the mail volume decline." So the first point we want to understand is, decline of first-class mail is a real issue. But second of all, like businesses all over this country, revenue is being impacted by the recession. And how we can get our country out of the recession, create more jobs, put more money into the hands of working people is, of course, a major, major issue that we must address. And in that regard, I do want to say that in the middle of this terrible recession, when real unemployment is not 8.2%, but in fact it is closer to 15%, counting those people who have given up looking for work, those people who are working part-time, it would seem to me that this body wants to do everything that we can not to see 200,000 jobs slashed at the United States Postal Service, many of them decent-paying jobs, many of them union jobs. Now, we may not be able to save every one of those jobs. We want the Postal Service to be efficient. But on the other hand, I would hope that we see as a significant priority that in the midst of a recession, you do not want to downsize a major American institution by 200,000 jobs, many of them, by the way, jobs belonging to veterans. A couple of months ago, a whole lot of debate here. How do we create jobs for veterans? Well, I can tell you one thing you don't do is downsize the Postal Service by 200,000 workers, many of them being veterans. But Mr. President talked about the decline in first-class mail, important, talked about the recession being important, but I want to raise another issue that I think many people are not familiar with, and that has nothing to do with first-class mail, nothing to do with the recession, or in fact, email or the Internet. And that is that to a very significant degree, the major reason that the Postal Service has been running a deficit since 2007 is due to accounting issues, accounting issues. For example, and everybody has got to understand this issue if we're going to have an open and honest debate about the future of the Postal Service. Due to a law passed in 2006, the U.S. Postal Service uniquely in America, uniquely within government, federal, state, local, uniquely in terms of the private sector, has been forced to pre-fund 75 years' worth of future retiree health benefits in just 10 years. 75 years' worth of future retiree health benefits in just 10 years. There is no other agency of government that comes close to that onerous requirement, nor are there any companies in the private sector that have been asked to do that. This mandate cost the U.S. Postal Service between $5.4 billion and $5.8 billion per year. So what I beg of my colleagues is, when you look at the financial problems facing the Postal Service, which are real, do not forget that because of this 2006 legislation, Postal Service needs to come up with approximately $5.5 billion every single year to pre-fund retiree health care. Mr. President, and this is an important point, and I hope my fellow colleagues in the Senate are listening to this. 100% of the Postal Service's $20 billion debt from 2007 to 2010 is the result of this pre-funding mandate. Let me repeat it. 100% of the Postal Service's $20 billion debt from 2007 to 2010 is the result of this $5.5 billion per year pre-funding mandate. Without this mandate, the Postal Service would have made a $700 million profit from 2007 to 2010. So let me repeat that, because these are facts that have not often been introduced into this debate. We have folks coming up here who are saying Postal Service is collapsing financially and so forth and so on. But it is important to understand the facts. And the facts are that despite the worst recession, which we're currently in right now since the 1930s, despite the competition from email and the Internet, the Postal Service would have made a $700 million profit from 2007 to 2010 if it was not forced to pre-fund future retiree health benefits. In addition, Mr. President, and I hope people listen to this as well, during the first quarter of 2012, a few months ago, the U.S. Postal Service would have generated a $200 million profit, had it not been required to pre-fund its future retiree health benefits. So I think, Mr. President, as we debate these issues about the future of the Post Office, it is absolutely imperative that we understand the role of the $5.5 billion every single year that the Postal Service has to come up with to pre-fund retiree health benefits. Now, Mr. President, a few months ago, I asked the Inspector General of the Postal Service, whose name is David C. Williams. He is the Inspector General of the Postal Service. I asked him to talk a little bit about what this pre-funding of health benefits meant. And I would like to introduce into the record a copy of his letter, which is dated February 6, 2012.
Without objection.
And if I might, because this is, I think, an important letter, I'd like to read a significant part of it. And I hope people appreciate what the Inspector General of the United States Postal Service is saying. This is a guy who knows something about the Postal Service. This is what he says. Dear Senator Sanders, this is a letter to me. He says, for several days last week, I met with you and your staff to discuss solutions to to the current financial crisis within the Postal Service. At the conclusion of those discussions, you requested that our office focus on one of the solutions that we presented, which examined an option to address the current benefit fund financing. This proposal would eliminate the requirement for the Postal Service to make annual $5.5 billion payments into its retiree health benefit fund and allow the $44 billion currently in the fund. Let me talk about that. There is right now, as a result of these funding payments, $44 billion currently in the fund to grow with interest. So what are you saying here? What happens if you got $44 billion and it accrues, as it does, interest, I believe, between 3% and 4% a year? And then he continues. If you did that, he said, no payments would be made from the fund until it is deemed to be fully funded, and the Postal Service would continue to directly pay for the health care premiums for retirees. An additional element of the proposal would allow current overpayments of $13.1 billion in the Postal Service pension funds to be funded to the Postal Service. This is also a point that has not been discussed enough, and in fact we do address in the current legislation. And that is, not only is the Postal Service being asked to come up with an onerous $5.5 billion a year to pre-fund future retiree health benefits, it is generally acknowledged, I think, by everybody who has studied the issue, that the Postal Service has made overpayments of $13.1 billion into the Federal Employment Retirement Service System and the Civil Service Retirement System, adding those two together. Now, this is what he says, and I quote, again, Inspector General, United States Postal Service, quote, our analysis of this proposal shows that if it were adopted, the amounts in retiree health care fund would grow from $44 billion to the $90 billion estimated current liability in 21 years. This $90 billion projected liability is not a static or precise figure. It varies a little bit, is what he's saying. But essentially, he says that if you don't add another nickel into the $44 billion, it will grow to $90 billion in 21 years and essentially take care of the payments that it has to take care of. So the point that I want to make here, Mr. President, is that in terms of future health, future retiree health benefits, we already have $44 billion in the account, and in my view, and in the view of people who know more about this issue than I do, it is not necessary to put more money into that account. And that is an issue that this legislation attempts to address. There's another point that well, I'll get to that point at some other point, Mr. President. But I think, let me conclude by saying this. The issue we're dealing with is of enormous consequence to our country. It is imperative, in my view, that we not shut down 3,700 rural post offices, and I want to commend the Postmaster General. We have been working with him, and he has moved away from that position. In my view, we have got to do everything that we can to make sure that we maintain very high standards for mail delivery in this country, so when a business puts a package in the mail, they know it's going to get delivered in a reasonable time. It's one of the strengths of the Postal Service. In my view, we do not want to shut down, as the Postmaster General's original proposal, half of the processing plants in this country, which would shut down, slow down mail delivery service. In my view, we do not want to end Saturday mail. I think it's an important part of maintaining strong mail delivery standards. But the main point that I wanted to make today is, yes, Postal Service faces financial problems, but not to understand the significant causation of those problems that is a result of the $5.5 billion in pre-health funding for retirees is to miss a very significant part of this debate. And I think it's fair to say that in this bill we are beginning to address that issue, also address the issue of the overpayment from the Postal Service to the Federal Employment Retirement System. So let me just conclude by thanking Senators Lieberman, Senators Collins, and Carper and Brown for the work they've done. I hope that we can have an intelligent and constructive and kind of nonpartisan discussion as we go forward, hearing from good amendments that are relevant from all sides, both sides of the aisle. But the bottom line is saving the Postal Service is enormously important for our economy and certainly for the tens and tens of thousands of workers who are out there every day doing a great job for us. So with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.